everyone. Today is the last lecture of the second module, Chemical Oceanography, and we're going to talk about marine sediments. Marine sediments are really important for understanding Earth's history in what we call paleoceanography. They record everything that's happening in the ocean and slowly accumulate it, and so then we can go back and look at it and try to understand what the past ocean was like. Marine sediments are sometimes used as resources, although we're not going to talk about that much in the lecture. But we will spend quite a bit of time talking about the various origins and the sources of marine sediments. So here you can see a picture of a typical photo of the bottom of the seafloor. Sediments are a combination of sort of all the gamush you might expect: dust, dirt, debris, particles. But essentially, they get to the seafloor through suspension settling. So sediments settle out of water, they slowly sink, and they accumulate on the ocean floor. And not all things sink and accumulate at the same rate. But overall, the sediments provide important clues to Earth's history. They tell us something about the distribution of organisms in the ocean. So you should now be thinking about what we learned about the distribution of primary productivity in the ocean and where different organisms live. That will be reflected in the sediments. They also provide important clues to the movement of the ocean floor. So you should be thinking back to the plate tectonics and things that we talked about there in terms of the origins of the oceans. There's information on ocean circulation, climate change, and global extinction events. All of this is recorded in the sediments. So we talk about and classify marine sediments in a handful of different ways. So one is by their texture, so the size and the shape of particles. And there's a couple of others that the reading mentions that I'm not going to go into in great detail. This isn't a geology course. But the origins of the sediments essentially are classified into four categories. Here they're sort of given colloquially as worn rocks, living organisms, minerals that dissolve, and from outer space. And most sediments in the ocean lithify into sedimentary rock, and they actually become part of the land. So, for example, a lot of mountain ranges have fossils in them from the seafloor, because at one point in time, even though it's a really high mountain range on land now, once upon a time in Earth's history, it was actually under the ocean, which is why you get things like, if you ever see in the store, like Himalayan sea salt. That sounds like kind of a strange thing. The Himalayas are a huge mountain range. What on earth do they have to do with sea salt? But in fact, the deposits in the Himalayas were once upon a time at the bottom of the seafloor. So this is a study table. I'm not going to dwell on it. It's in the lecture slides, but it just is a nice way to break down the different classifications of marine sediments by their type, where you find them, what they're made up of, what their origins are, etc. So how do we know stuff about marine sediments? It's really interesting. So some of you might be familiar with the fact that South Africa has an icebreaking ship, and it's this huge, beautiful research vessel. But the one thing it can't do is collect stuff from the deep ocean, and there's actually specialized ships for that, and you can see that in this photo here. And if it looks like an oil drilling ship, that's because it's the same technology, essentially, that they use to drill oils. Anytime you need to drill a giant hole in something really far away, you have limited technological options. So this ship is known as the JOIDES Resolution. It's a fairly famous sediment collecting ship. Before we had these sophisticated ships, people used to just drag things along the bottom, known as dredging. But now it's done through these cores. So you have this hollow steel tube known as a core, and then you have a rotary driller. And so the ship, it's kind of amazing. The ship has to stay still in, let's say, 4 kilometers of water. And it sends down these drill pipes, and it actually uses a rotary bit to drill this giant hole into the deep ocean. It's kind of an amazing technological feat. So paleoceanography is the study of the past, oceans, circulation, biology, climate, all of it. And it's a really fascinating field of oceanography that has to do with, it really connects sort of all aspects of oceanography. It connects the chemistry, it connects the biology, And you have to understand all of it to be able to understand the past ocean. And most paleoceanographers use something from the sediments. So this is a photo of a sediment core, and this should look familiar based on your prac. And this is, I think, a really beautiful shot that shows the layering that you see in sediments. Each one of these layers is telling you something about that time in Earth's history. And this is the example of a core you would collect from the seafloor that then has been cut in half. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the classifications here, the various origins. So lithogenous marine sediment is sediment that has derived from land. Biogenous marine sediment is sediment that has derived from organisms in the sea. Hydrogenous, or sometimes called authigenic sediment, is sediment that has derived from the water itself. So these are your evaporites and things. And then cosmogenous, possibly the coolest of the marine sediment types, is debris derived from outer space. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of it, and so there's not quite as much to say about it as the other types. So lithogenous sediment is eroded rock fragments that come from land. You also hear the expression terrigenous. And basically, the lithogenous sediment is going to look like whatever the rock looked like. And so what happens is you have rocks on land that undergo some kind of weathering. This cartoon sort of shows it here. It creates fractures. The fractures break down into smaller and smaller pieces until you get to something that can actually be transported out to sea. So these small particles, they get eroded over time and transported in a variety of different ways. So they can come from rivers and streams and be deposited in the ocean through the continental shelf. They become smaller and smaller to the point where they can be uplifted by wind. So you can think of, dust and things blowing around. They can also be carried to the ocean by glaciers. So as glaciers move really slowly over land, they scrape stuff up, and you start to end up with pieces of rock and all sorts of boulders and stones in the glacier. And then eventually the glacier gets to the sea and starts to melt, and so all of those things start to be released back into the ocean. And then, of course, gravity, as things are just breaking off. As you might expect, the greatest quantity of lithogenous or terrigenous sediment in the ocean happens around continental margins where you're closest to the land. Here, you've got some cool images. So on the far left, you can see all of this white stuff that's coming out of the Po River here. In Italy is all of the sediment that's being distributed and then sort of swirled around on the continental shelf. In the middle, you've got an image of a dust storm. So that's a really effective way of getting dust and lithogenous sediment into the ocean. And on the right, you can see a picture of a glacier in North America where there's this dark stripe of rock that's been picked up. So as this glacier slowly inches out into the sea, all of this debris is going to be dropped off in the ocean. The lithogenous sediments tend to look like whatever kind of rock they're derived from. The larger pieces will remain close to shore, and the smaller, finer pieces will make it offshore. Although for the most part, a lot of it is like mineral quartz. Here you can see a map showing the predominant wind direction off the continents where you end up with lots of dust deposition of quartz. So they tend to be, for example, off the coast of the Saharan desert is a place where you have these massive deserts and then you have wind and you end up with this quartz deposition. Same here, this is dust deposition, dust deposition. So what ends up happening is when you're sort of near shore and you have these sediments coming off, if you have lots and lots of wave action, you're going to end up with the larger particles depositing, and the smaller ones just keep going. So the smaller ones get swept away from the continental shelf. If you have a low energy environment where not a lot of waves, then everything gets deposited close to shore. But typically, because things tend to be rougher closer to shore, your larger particles get deposited first, and then it goes down in size until your smaller particles get deposited the farthest away from shore. The other thing to think about is sorting. And this is a measure of how uniform the grain sizes are. And it's really useful to tell you something about what process was used to transport the sediment. And when something's well sorted, it means everything's the same size. And that would be like from a river. And if something's poorly sorted, it means there's different size particles mixed together. And the example for that would be like your glacial deposits. So even though they're both terrigenous, you can learn something about whether they're more likely to be from a river or from a glacier by the distribution of the sizes. So further, we classify sediments as being neritic versus pelagic. Neritic meaning they're shallow water deposits that are close to land. So neritic sediments are almost always completely lithogenous because they're coastal, and they tend to be deposited very quickly. Whereas pelagic sediments are in your deeper water. They tend to be finer grained because all of that that's the smaller size. All of the coarse, heavy stuff has already been deposited close to land here. And everything's a bit slower. So you don't have these, the rivers, the glaciers, all of that's, your sort of fast stuff that happens close to shore. And your slower processes, your wind-driven, your cosmogenic, they're all happening more in the pelagic ocean, the open ocean. So you can think of this as essentially neritic versus pelagic is coastal ocean versus open ocean. So if you think about lithogenous sediment and break it down in these additional categories of neritic versus pelagic, so thinking first about the neritic, it's your beach deposits, so it's your waves depositing quartz, continental shelf deposits, turbidites, which we're not going to talk about too much, and your glacial deposits. Pelagic sediments are finer grain materials, so smaller things. They accumulate more slowly. And so your pelagic lithogenous sediments would be things like volcanoes that are going to erupt and then be carried by the atmosphere sort of everywhere, even on the open ocean, which is connected, of course, to then any other windblown dust is going to be a pelagic lithogenous sediment. And then anything that's really fine grained, so stuff that comes from, let's say, a river or a glacier on the coast, but it's really, really small, and so it just keeps getting transported. It doesn't actually deposit it out. It stays in the water for a long time until it makes it into a deep ocean current. Okay, a lot of your pelagic deposits, so out in the open ocean, are abyssal clays. And most of this clay-sized particles also come from continents, although the red clays come from oxidized iron. And the abyssal clays, you sort of think of them as being, if there's nothing else interesting happening or not much going on, you're going to have abyssal clays lying around. It's just sort of what's there if nothing else exciting is going on. Okay, so now moving completely away from lithogenous sediments and getting into the second big category, which is biogenous sediment. So biogenous sediment, you've got a clue in the name. It's from bio. So these are the hard parts of once living organisms. Some are visible to the naked eye, so that would be things like shells and bones and teeth. But the vast majority are microscopic. You can't actually see them unless you have a microscope. And these are tiny shells, are referred to as tests, or biogenic ooze. And biogenous sediment mainly comes from algae and protozoans, and we'll talk about specific examples. So the two main types of biogenous sediment are calcium carbonate and silica. All right, and so these are important to keep these in mind, that these are two different categories to the two main types of biogenous sediment. So starting with silica, so your biogenous silica sediments comes from two places. Comes from diatoms, which is, you can see in the photo here, and you note the scale bar because it's 10 microns. So diatoms are photosynthetic algae, and they make these silica sort of boxes for themselves that they live in. They're very, very small, but they're made of silica. And so when the diatom inside dies, this shell sinks down to the seafloor. And if you've ever heard the expression diatomaceous earth, that's directly from this. These diatoms are frequently used as great filtration systems. So diatoms are phytoplankton, because they're photosynthetic. And radiolarians are zooplankton, so non-photosynthetic. So I'll just write that there, zooplankton. We haven't talked about zooplankton much. This is a photo of a radiolarian. They also make silica shells for themselves. They're protozoans. That's where the zooplankton comes from. And you can see they put these really cool sort of like spine spicules here that give them extra buoyancy. And so when we talk about biogenous sediments, it's that these organisms have built these silica shells for themselves, and then they die, and their shells sink to the seafloor. We refer to these silica shells as tests. And these diatoms and radiolarians, if there's enough of them sinking, they generate siliceous ooze. That's the name we give to Siliceous ooze is the name we give to biogenous sediment that comes from silica. So these here were sort of showing you single cells. This is more like what you'd see if you looked at a microscopic image where there's a bunch of stuff together. And you can see all the various fragments of the things that have sort of broken off. You know, there's maybe a whole test, but all these little broken pieces and everything. That's siliceous ooze. Siliceous ooze, because it's made primarily from diatoms, will lithify into diatomaceous earth. And this is used commercially in a whole ton of things, a bunch of ways that you didn't realize you were interacting with diatoms. Well, you are. Okay, so switching to moving away from silica to the second type of biogenous ooze. Now we're going to talk about calcium carbonate in biogenic sediments. Calcium carbonate is formed primarily from coccolithophores, and this is a photo here of coccolithophores, again, very, very small. They're phytoplankton, photosynthetic algae, right? And the diatoms I was just talking about are also photosynthetic algae. They're very small, so they're sometimes called nanoplankton. But coccolithophores create these really cool little plates around themselves that are known as coccoliths. And they have each of these little individual plates, which is like, they're building these plates. And then the organism dies and they sink and you end up with these cool little spheres. So the zooplankton that creates calcium carbonate are known as foraminifera. Thankfully, most people call them forams, which I will here. So this is your zooplankton, your protozoan. Much like the radiolarians were also a protozoan. But these guys can make calcium carbonates, really cool little shells. And they almost look like normal seashells a little bit. They've got these like chambers that they make for themselves, but again, they're quite small. And when there's a lot of forams and coccoliths together, this is referred to as calcareous ooze. So siliceous ooze and calcareous ooze. Okay, so where do we find these two types of biogenous sediments? So their distribution in the seafloor is dependent on a couple of things. The first being productivity. You have to have a lot of them in the water, okay? So you have to be in a region where there's a lot of these things growing. The other thing is there can't be too much destruction of their shells. So it means that the skeletal remains, or the tests, their cool little shells, can't dissolve. If they dissolve, obviously you're not going to see them at the seafloor. And then the other thing is there can't be too much dilution. So meaning, if there's a lot of these cool shells and tests, but there's so much other stuff that you don't see them, then you're not really going to have a lot of biogenous sediment. You're not going to be able to see it. And so deposition of other stuff can decrease the percentage of biogenous sediments. So pelagic deposits, the open ocean, you can find quite a bit of siliceous ooze. You only see it in areas of really high productivity and in places where the silica won't dissolve. And that's really important. So the seawater chemistry plays a role. So this here is, I think, a really nice cartoon showing on the left, if you have an area of fairly low productivity, so this is your surface ocean, and each of these little dots is one of your silica-creating organisms. And so there's some guys growing here, and they're sinking, right? And then what ends up happening is the rate of silica tests making it to the seafloor isn't that high. And so the silica mostly ends up dissolving. And so it dissolves in the water column. And so by the time you get to the seafloor, there isn't really a lot that has the chance to accumulate, so you don't see siliceous ooze. So if you look back in Earth's time at sediments from this region, you would have no way of knowing what was growing, or that there was a diatoms growing in this area. But what you do know is that there wasn't a ton of diatoms. Because if you move to an area of high productivity, and you can see there's a lot more dots in the water here, you've got lots of silica tests sinking. And here, the rate of supply is greater than the rate of dissolution. And so in this case, you've got this big mound of siliceous ooze that's accumulated here on top of your abyssal clays. So if you look back in Earth's history at a sediment core from this area, you'll see, if you were to cut a core out of this, you would see that at this point in time, there was an area of really high productivity. So thinking about biogenous sediments in coastal areas and neritic deposits, these neritic deposits tend to be dominated by the lithogenous sediment, but there are times when they can contain biogenous sediment. Usually it would be carbonate deposits, and these would be carbonate deposits as limestone. And most limestone has fossil shells, which suggests it's of biogenous origin. And so there are some of these marine carbonates. Okay, the other thing to think about, and I think this is sort of an interesting cartoon as well to help think about how all of this is actually working. Okay, so we've got the surface of the ocean up here, and let's start on the left. We've got warm surface waters where you've got your calcite secreting organisms. So these are your little, let's say, coccolithophores up here on the surface, and they're sinking, okay? And on the sea floor, you've got your oceanic crust. And up here, you've got the mid-ocean ridge. So this mid-ocean ridge is up much higher. And so you've got these calcite-secreting organisms, and they're sinking. So let's first think about the mid-ocean ridge. So here, you would have some calcareous ooze that would deposit on the mid-ocean ridge. Whereas if you went out to the left, so remember, this sea floor is spreading, right? So it's depositing, and over time, this sediment is moving, this sea floor is moving this way. And as it moves, the abyssal clays start to settle on it. And so this calcium carbonate ooze gets abyssal clay on it, and you have this like layering effect. Whereas away from where the mid-ocean ridge is, at some point, you're going to hit the calcite compensation depth. And we didn't talk about this in detail. It was in the reading a little bit. But just think of it as the place where these shells start to dissolve. And so this productivity on this side, you're not going to see because it's going to hit this place and start dissolving. But you will see calcium carbonate ooze from the mid-ocean ridge. Likewise, if you go to the right side here, you got colder waters where we've got our silica secreting organisms. And that's where the diatoms tend to live. So they're coming down and being deposited as siliceous ooze, okay? And again, you've got calcium carbonate underneath that siliceous ooze, but it's not from these cold waters. It's from the mid-ocean ridge where it then has slid down underneath. So this just gives you sort of an example of hypotheticals of what can be happening at the seafloor and how we can connect it to what's happening at the surface of the ocean. Here, this is a map showing the distribution of modern calcium carbonate sediments, so where you're more likely to find your calcareous ooze, and the orange being where it's the greatest. And you can see a lot of it is at the mid-ocean ridge. So just like we were showing here, the calcareous stuff, it can accumulate here. You can see that in the real data, where these orange and dark orange falls along the mid-ocean ridge, which the mid-ocean ridge is given by this sort of jagged line here. So you can see where the seafloor is elevated above that point, that calcium, that CCG, where everything dissolves, the calcium carbonate has a chance to accumulate, and that's exactly what we see. Okay, so moving on to the third type of marine sediments. So first we had lithogenous, and then we had biogenous, and now we're introducing hydrogenous. And this is where minerals precipitate, so they go from dissolved to particulate directly from seawater. And examples of these are manganese nodules, phosphates, carbonates, and metal sulfides. There's not a ton of hydrogenous sediments. You don't see a lot of them, but they are distributed sort of randomly all over the place. The coolest of the hydrogenous sediments are manganese nodules, by far. If you look at the scale bar here, 5 centimeters, they're about the size of a small fist. They're lumps of manganese and iron. They have very, 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 very slow accumulation rates. So like a millimeter per 100 million years or something like that. They have commercial uses, but no one's ever actually mined them successfully for all sorts of reasons. People don't really know, scientists don't really know why they form and why they don't get buried. It's a bit of a mystery. So this is a photo of what it looks like on the seafloor when you have a bunch of manganese nodules. And because we don't know a ton about them, you tend to sort of just stumble across them every once in a while. And you can see if you cut it in half, it has like some sort of a nucleation object in the middle. And then it's sort of just like layers around it. They're really cool. So very difficult to know, to allow the idea of mining them for the manganese, because at an accumulation rate of 1 millimeter per 100 million years, it's not like it's going to regenerate itself anytime soon. Okay, so then we also have cosmogenous marine sediments, the ones from outer space, which is super cool. You can see here that gives you the rough scale size. So this is debris from meteors and tektites and space dust. It's made of a variety of different types of metals. It's not a very significant part of marine sediments, but you always see them included, I think just because it's interesting. That's all cosmogenous sediments get, is one slide. So this is a nice sort of overall schematic that shows how you end up with different sediment types in different parts of the ocean. It is true that not everywhere has everything. When you're looking at a particular part of the seafloor, there is usually 1 or 2 sediment types that dominate. But you can see, you guys can sort of spend your own time looking through this about the different types of sediments that can accumulate in various places and why. This is a map I really like. I think it's interesting. Sort of shows, it's based on real data. The neritic and pelagic sediments, so neritic meaning near shore. So in the brown is your continental stuff. And you can see it tends to be close to around the continents, and it's about a quarter of the seafloor. The other colors are all your pelagic stuff. So your calcareous ooze is in blue, and again, it tends to be near the mid-ocean ridge and higher areas. Your siliceous ooze is in green and yellow, and it's actually broken down into diatoms and radiolarians. You see that a lot more in your upwelling, colder areas. So for example, in the Southern Ocean, you can see quite a bit of that green there. And then your abyssal clays are the pinks. And again, that's sort of like the middle of the ocean where there isn't, the lithogenous stuff hasn't made it out there, and the productivity and the chemistry isn't conducive to calcareous or siliceous oozes, so that's where you sort of just see the abyssal clays. So the sediment distribution, to sort of recap, is controlled by how close it is to the source of lithogenous sediments, so how close to the coast, how productive the waters are, and what type of organisms there are, how deep it is, and that's directly linked to the sort of chemistry of whether things can dissolve or not dissolve, and what the seafloor looks like. Here, this is another sort of big picture look, and this gives you the global ocean view. So most of the global ocean sediments are biogenous. I shouldn't say most. I should say one of the largest fractions is calcareous ooze, the other being abyssal clays, and then you've got your siliceous oozes in your other. But if you look at the various ocean basins, you can see that distribution is definitely not always the same. For example, the North Pacific has a ton of abyssal clays, whereas the North Atlantic has a lot of calcareous oozes. And it just depends on the local environment. The last thing, just before we wrap up, is that we've talked about the composition, but we haven't said anything about the sediment thickness. And so the thickness has to do with how much stuff there is. And so you can see the red, the really thick stuff is along the coasts where you've got lots of stuff coming off the continent. But it also has to do with plate tectonics and the movement of plates. So obviously along the mid-ocean ridge, where the plates are really young, they just haven't had time to accumulate stuff. And so there's going to be, the sediment is going to be a lot thinner than in places where the plates are much older. So as you move towards the continents, you've got these older plates and you've got stuff coming off from land. So the sediments are a lot thicker there. So that's just